So of the 6 flags that are included in each TCP segment, the really important ones are first SYN, which is short for synchronize, AC, which is short for acknowledge, and FIN, which is short for finished, as in finished sending data. As I mentioned, the AC flag is set whenever the acknowledgement number in the segment is valid, when it's actually meaningful and shouldn't be ignored. The SYN flag is only set in the first packet exchanged by each end of a connection when they establish the connection. And then a TCP segment is sent with the FIN flag when that end of the connection has no more data to send. It's used to indicate to the other end that, hey, I'm done, there's no more data coming. And as we'll see, a TCP connection remains open until both sides send a FIN. If one side has sent a FIN but the other side hasn't, then the side which sent the FIN is not going to send more data, but it might still receive more data. Only when it receives the FIN from the other side does the connection close. So first let's look at how SYN and AC are used to establish a TCP connection. A TCP connection is established with what's called a three-way handshake. Typically we think of one side of the connection as the server and the other side as the client, because the server is the side that's sitting and listening for any incoming connection, and the client is the other system which initiates a connection. So, for example, when you use a web browser, your web browser is the client, and when you visit a web page, the web server on the other end is sitting and listening for any incoming TCP connections. And your browser sends a request to make a connection, and the server and your browser engage then in the TCP three-way handshake. And first what happens is that the client sends a segment with the SYN flag set, and then the server responds with both the SYN and AC flag set, and then the client responds in turn with its own AC. Now, the primary purpose of this handshake is before any data can be sent, the client and the server need to exchange sequence numbers. Both the client and the server pick their own random sequence number, and they need to tell the other end what sequence number they have picked. And very crucially, because TCP is meant to be reliable, both ends of the connection want to make sure that the other end received what they sent, so they want an acknowledgement. So here's what the three-way handshake might look like in a little more detail. First, the client picks a sequence number of 3040, and so it sends a segment with the SYN flag set and the sequence number set to 3040, and then the server responds with the own sequence number that it has picked, which is here 700,200, and it acknowledges that it received sequence number 3040 with the AC number 3041. Why 3041 and not 3040? Well, acknowledgement numbers are supposed to indicate the next expected sequence number. So the acknowledgement here from the server means I have everything up to but not including 3041. And then likewise the client acknowledges that it has received everything up to but not including 700,201. So now that the connection has been established, either side of the connection can send data to the other. So now let's say that the client sends a segment to the server with 20 bytes of actual data, and the sequence number of 3041 in the segment indicates where these 20 bytes fit in the whole sequence of data coming from the client to the server. Once the server receives that segment, it sends back an acknowledgement of 3061 because it has received everything in the sequence up to but not including 3061. So conceptually, you should think of the data flowing from one end of the connection to the other as a sequence which starts from the randomly chosen sequence number from which the bytes in the data are numbered. So here, in the sequence of data from the client to the server, the SYN segment itself is numbered 3040. It's as if that SYN itself is like a byte of data, even though it's not. And then thereafter, the first byte of data is 3041, the one after is 3042, 3043, and 4, 5. And then finally, the last byte of data we've sent so far has sequence number 3060. So the acknowledgement sent back from the server is 3061. The server has received every byte in the sequence up to but not including 3061. Now, you're probably wondering why the client sends another acknowledgement when it sends the data. And the answer is that, well, in the segment header, there's always space for an acknowledgement. So in fact, after the very first SYN segment in a connection, every segment thereafter is always going to include the acknowledgement number. So even though this acknowledgement is redundant, we might as well send it anyway because we're sending data. For the sake of efficiency, when data is received, The receiver may actually choose to wait a little while to see if additional data segments arrive. That way it only has to send out one acknowledgement for multiple segments rather than sending out one for each. So here, for example, first the client sends out a segment of 20 bytes and then soon after another of 12 bytes, but rather than responding immediately to that first segment, the server waits a little while and then the second one arrives. And so it sends out just a single acknowledgement of 3074. Because it has received up to that point every byte up to but not including sequence number 3074. Another possibility is that the server itself has some data to send, so it simply includes the acknowledgement with the data segment. And notice that in turn, because it has sent data, now the client needs to respond with an acknowledgement. Now, as a mechanism for acknowledging received data, these ACK numbers are a bit crude. Consider again the scenario where the client sends to the server two segments of data, first 20 bytes and then 12 bytes, but this time imagine that the first segment doesn't reach its destination. For whatever reason, the server doesn't receive it. What's going to happen then is that the server is going to send back an acknowledgement of 3041, even though the server has received the 12 bytes that start at 3061. So the acknowledgement number says I've received the complete sequence up to N, but it can't get more specific. If pieces have been received beyond that point, it can't specify which pieces have been received and which hasn't. So here in this case, the client doesn't know which of the two segments of data it sent didn't reach the server, so it has to simply send all of the data rather than just the portion which the server didn't receive. When one side of a TCP connection is done sending data, the proper thing to do is for it to send what's called a FIN segment, a segment with the FIN flag set. This flag simply indicates to the other side of the connection, hey, I'm not going to send you any more data. And then the proper thing is to respond with an acknowledgement. So, for example, say again we establish a connection where the client sends the sequence number 3040 and the server sends the sequence number 700,200. And now, assuming in this scenario that the client has no intention of ever sending any data to the server over this connection, it can simply, at the outset, close its side of the connection. That is, indicate to the server that, hey, I'm not going to be sending you any more data. So the client sends a segment with the FIN flag set, and then the server responds with an acknowledgement. And notice that when the server responds, it responds with an acknowledgement that is one greater than 3041, because just like the SYN in the opening handshake, the FIN flag itself counts like a byte of data in the sequence. So one way to think of it is that the FIN is like the last byte in the sequence, even though of course it's not a byte of data. So here, for example, if the sequence begins with 3040 and then we send 20 bytes of data, the last byte of data has the sequence number 3060, and then the FIN itself is going to have the sequence number 3061. Now, be clear that to close the whole connection itself, you have to wait for both sides to send a FIN. So imagine in this scenario, just for illustration, that after receiving FIN from the client, the server then immediately decides, well, I want to close too. And so it sends its own FIN segment, and then the client responds with an acknowledgement, and now both sides of the connection know that both sides have been closed, and so they both know that their business with this connection is done. The connection is over. Again, be clear though that one side of the connection can be closed, and the other side can continue to send data for as long as it wants, really. Programs are under no obligation to close their side of the connection when they receive a FIN from the other side. So really that's all there is to a TCP connection. The only thing we haven't discussed are the details of the algorithms for maximizing the efficiency of the connection, making sure that one side, for instance, isn't sending too much data to overwhelm the other side, or how precisely should one side of the connection time its acknowledgements, and so forth. In practice, of course, such things are important if we're actually implementing TCP, though in practice, of course, these things are implemented for us. So those details can be interesting, but they're also sort of superfluous.